Hello, everybody. I'm Allison Kushner. I am the ADA coordinator and the director of the Disability Equity Office within the Equity, Civil Rights, and Title IX office here at the University of Michigan. Thank you for joining today. Just a few tips and reminders. This workshop is also being recorded and will be made available as soon as possible. The slides will be emailed to all registered participants within likely the next day or so. Along with an anonymous survey, we really do want to encourage you to complete this short survey as it helps us to determine how we can best assist the community with your learning goals. Before we get started, we'll take a minute to go over some accessibility reminders. For Zoom webinar, use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. There is an anonymous option to send those in through the Q&A as well. ASL interpretation is available and can be utilized by clicking Interpretation and selecting American Sign Language. And CART transcription can be turned on by selecting Show Captions. If you have any difficulty, I do have moderator with me, Erin Metz, who can assist in any questions you have, and will also be monitoring our Q&A feature as well. And a very big thank you to our ASL interpreter and CART provider. So before we get started, we want to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is committed to fostering an inclusive environment where accessibility and the needs of disabled individuals are prioritized, ensuring equitable opportunities for all members of our diverse community. Today, we will be covering the who, what, why, and when of disability disclosure for both employees and students, obligations of supervisors, HR reps, and instructors when they do receive a disclosure, and disability inclusive considerations for responding to these disclosures. Now, we will be covering a lot of information today, and for many people, it may be new or it could be a refresher. So please keep this in mind. We are trying to model a safe and brave space, and we do encourage questions and respect the experience of others. So please be sure to engage, ask questions. And again, Erin will keep an eye on the Q&A, and I should have time at the end to ask any additional questions that may come in. So today we're going to discuss disclosure, which is the first step to receive accommodations under the ADA. And I want to provide you all with a brief disclaimer. So if you've heard our office present before, you know that we typically utilize or prescribe to a psychosocial model of disability in our work. However, today we're going to focus mainly on the legal model because the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, is the foundation of all disability inclusion work because it requires actions by employers, public places, private businesses, and places of education to, at a minimum, provide accommodation and access. Keep in mind while we discuss these concepts that disclosure really is the first step to creating a disability inclusive workplace and community and university. So just as a disclosure, we do absolutely continue to support the psychosocial model, as well as going beyond just the basic compliance required by the ADA. So what is disability disclosure? Under the ADA, disability disclosure is when either an applicant, an employee, or student voluntarily shares information about their disability with either their employer or their school. Keep in mind, there are no magic words. An individual does not need to use a specific word like disability, and it does not need to be in writing. Further, and we'll talk about this a bit later, Your disclosure should not include a diagnosis if you're making that disclosure to your supervisor or instructor. So one question we get is, what's the difference between disclosure and self-identification? So disability disclosure is, of course, initiated by the applicant, employee, or student when they perhaps need to request an accommodation during the application, interview, or hiring process, or throughout their employment. Self-identification as an individual with a disability means a voluntary and confidential process for providing information about disability status that's used typically for statistical purposes only. So it's important to mention self-identification because the data that's collected is included in our affirmative action plan, which is really one of the only high-level ways we can get a good measure of the university's overall effectiveness of organizational-wide disability inclusion. Now, I want to note that in the current climate and as we enter 2025, that we, of course, know that there are going to be questions about self-ID. Currently, federal law requires the university to send out a request to ask everybody who's employed to update their self-ID every 5 years. However, for now, this process is going to continue until we hear otherwise. So we'll have some information in this PowerPoint that will go over the steps of disclosure. Of course, if anything does change in the near future, we will keep you all updated as best we can. So turning to how you complete your voluntary self-identification. Again, it does create a pivotal role in creating inclusive workspaces, and it helps provide a better understanding about not only how many individuals have a disability currently, but also how do we retain individuals with disabilities as an employer. Typically, it measures that commitment to accessibility, and again, it is done through your Wolverine Access. There's a photo on the left of the voluntary self-identification of disability form. This is what you would likely see when you go in through Wolverine Access. You would then click on Employee Self-Service, go to Campus Personal Information, and select Disability Status. So turning to disability disclosure, that's going to basically be the only information that we provide on self-ID. But for disclosure, we look at this as maybe the first step in the interactive process, which is the informal conversation between an employer or an educator with their employee or the student to determine reasonable accommodations necessary for the disabled individual to receive accommodation and ensure equal access to their employment as well as to their educational experience. The other steps of the interactive process include that determination of disability, the discussion between the employee and student and their employer or school, which can be through a designated office, like here at the University of Michigan, either through the Disability Equity Office or Services for Students with Disabilities. And once there's an agreement between the two, the employer and the employee, or the student and the office that provides the accommodations, this is then documented so that individuals have a record of what has been discussed and what is being provided. Once that disclosure occurs, regardless of at any stage in the phases of academics or employment, the employer and the school has to recognize that disclosure and then begin to engage in that interactive process. So under the ADA, an employer's ability to make disability-related inquiries or require medical exams is analyzed in 3 phases of employment that we're going to talk about. At the first stage, which is really the pre-offer of employment, The ADA prohibits all disability-related inquiries and medical exams, even if they are related to the job. So really, pre-offer, it is pretty much prohibited. Post-offer, at the second stage, after an applicant is given a conditional job offer, but before the job begins, or similarly for students, if for whatever reason there is a component to their acceptance, an employer may make disability-related inquiries and conduct medical examination, regardless of whether they're related to the job, as long as it does so for all individuals entering into that particular class of job or category. So again, post-offer, it can be done whether or not is related to the job, and we'll give examples of those in just a minute. And then when somebody is employed, they have already started, they're getting a paycheck, whatever the case may be, this third stage, an employer can make disability-related inquiries and require medical examinations only if they are job-related and consistent with business necessity. So that is a lot of words that we're going to try to unpack now. So what does it mean for an employer to ask a disability-related inquiry? This is a question or a series of questions that might be likely to elicit information about a disability. And these same standards for determining whether a question is disability-related are utilized both pre and post offer of the stages of employment. So only the disability-related inquiries and medical exams are subject to the ADA's restrictions. Therefore, the first step is to determine if the employer's question is actually disability-related inquiry or whether the test or procedure is requiring medical exam. So the job-related and consistent with business necessity really means that an employer has a reasonable belief based on objective evidence that either the ability to perform the essential functions will be impaired by a medical condition, or that an employee will pose a direct threat due to the medical condition. And again, this is the same at the pre and post-employment stages. And we'll come back to kind of unpack and discuss a couple examples of that after we discuss the why of disability. So why to disclose a disability? First off, from a legal or compliance-related perspective, individuals may choose to disclose their disability to receive accommodations in employment or in higher education, or even to participate in events and processes here at the university as well. It is important to keep in mind that there's no obligation of any individual with a disability to disclose it, and it is a legally protected choice. And there's also no obligation to disclose it to a school or employer. Other individuals in the disability community may make the decision to proactively disclose because their disability is part of their identity, and they're claiming that identity in a positive way. Through disclosure, an employee or student may choose to disclose to share their stories or lived experience, again, to express pride in disability identity, or unintentionally. And we're going to talk about how somebody unintentionally discloses disability right now. So when we think about how somebody may unintentionally disclose a disability, we want to recognize that there are varying types of disabilities, and they cross the spectrum of apparent, sometimes apparent, and also non-apparent disabilities. For those that may have an apparent and sometimes apparent disability, they may not have a choice but to disclose their disability. So this would include somebody that might use a wheelchair or another assistive device. They may be somebody that is utilizing a service animal, or somebody experiencing other apparent symptoms or limitations. It is also important to keep in mind that the mere existence of an apparent disability does not indicate that somebody needs an accommodation. For example, we receive questions about what we do to assist somebody when we learn that either a student or an employee uses a wheelchair. Our response is typically always, beyond creating an inclusive and accessible environment for everybody, there's no need to assume somebody with an apparent disability needs an accommodation. And under the ADA, if a specific accommodation is needed by the employee or student, they do need to disclose that they have that disability and need an accommodation. So keeping in mind, even if it is an apparent disability, that onus is still on the employee or student to request the reasonable accommodation. Okay, we're going to see if this works. It's time for a poll. And keep in mind, for the purposes of this poll, self-ID means employees who are voluntarily and confidentially providing information. So what percentage of employees do you think disclose to their employer for self-ID purposes? So we are quite split. We'll give it a second to come in. And I thank you for participating. So we've got individuals thinking 25 to 30% of individuals with a disability will fill out that self-ID or their self-disclosure. And I think we can stop sharing that poll now. And then we have just a few people that think it's less than 5%. What we are, let me make that smaller. So what we're looking at is an answer that it is actually less than 5% or 3.2% of individuals with disabilities who self-ID to their employer. So a representative study that was done, it was very comprehensive in 2016 by the Center for Talent Acquisition, found that for full-time white-collar occupations with at least with employees who had at least a bachelor's degree, it was just about 3.2% of employees identified being disabled. While 30% of these same employees identify personally as having a disability, it was only 3.2% that disclosed. So interestingly, the same study found that the numbers are similar across gender and generation, with only a very slight increase in self-identification as an employee with a disability among millennials. And we're talking less than about 1%. So it may seem obvious to some people who either have disabilities or who work in the field of disability as to why these numbers are so low. So we're going to take a minute and talk about why people don't disclose. We do get lots of questions as well about how come an employee didn't disclose the need for the accommodation or their disability upon hire. And while everyone has different reasons for disclosing and choosing not to disclose, research has been done, a significant amount, about why. The why of non-disclosure. So we have some of those larger buckets here. So there is a risk of not being accepted by their peers or colleagues, being fired or not hired if they are disclosing in an interview, concern about losing access to healthcare, concern that employers and coworkers or peers, as well as instructors, perceive and interact with them differently once they do disclose. There's a risk of being passed over for promotions, leadership opportunities in the workplace and classroom. And perhaps they're unaware of their rights or what constitutes a disability under the ADA, as well as privacy. Disabled employees also frequently are subjected to discrimination and ableism in the workplace, whether intentionally or unintentionally. 34% of employees in that same 2016 study reported experiencing discrimination and bias while working for their current employer. So this underscores why many employees may not disclose their disability. And among apparent disability type, we have 44% who have apparent disabilities that reported discrimination. Sometimes apparent, meaning it can be sometimes symptoms are visible to some at certain periods, like a condition like epilepsy. Sometimes they may be apparent, or sometimes they can be non-apparent. That's about 40% have experienced discrimination. And then those with non-apparent disabilities. So these would be some of the neurological conditions, perhaps individuals who have a diagnosis that affects a bodily function that others are not able to detect. That is the lowest at 30%, which again underscores why individuals may choose not to disclose. And as we know, employees, just like every other employee with or without a disability, discusses their lived experience with peers and colleagues, or their experiences with other employers, or just in their own lived experience. And of course, while we strive to ensure that when we are providing accommodations in the interactive process, that it's a positive experience, many times for individuals, they choose not to disclose because they fear what those negative consequences could be. Individuals in the same study reported feeling 42% of them felt misjudged by colleagues and peers, 31% experienced insults, 20% experience avoidance, which can be that exclusionary type of behavior where perhaps you're no longer included in groups, or your information that you might have to share is looked over. And then, of course, just general discomfort. Things did not go the same for them as it did before disclosure was made. So another question in our presentation today is the when of disability disclosure. So when should we or I disclose my disability? And that is a question we get quite often as well. The easiest answer to provide is that the disabled applicant, employee, or student should disclose when disclosure would facilitate a request for accommodations needed either in their classes or in the workplace. So we're going to launch poll number 2 if everything works well. And look at that, it did. So, true or false, an employee needs to disclose their disability after the offer of employment or at the beginning of their employment to receive reasonable accommodations in their position later on. All right, we're going to give it a second for people to answer. We've got a lot of people who think that is false, and still some that think it's true. All right, so we have about 60% participation, and it looks like false is the winner there, and that is correct. Employees do not have to disclose their disability at the time of hire, and it does not preclude them from receiving an accommodation later on in employment. It is important to note, however, that accommodations under the ADA are not retroactive. So as we kind of discussed or touched on earlier, there are 3 main buckets of disclosure, but they can be kind of broken down a bit further. Within each of these buckets are a few different options of particular accommodations that may be available, common types that we see often, and we'll discuss those briefly. So within the life cycle of an employment, we have the recruitment phase, pre-application and interview. We have the after offer but before start date, after a job or school starts, and then, of course, at any time an accommodation is requested. So pre-employment in the application phase, interview phase, and the pre-offer phase. Um, However, what an employer can ask, of course, depends on whether or not that offer's been made. So when an accommodation is requested for the hiring process and the need for the accommodation itself is obvious, the employer can ask an applicant for reasonable documentation about their disability. For example, an individual who may request an accommodation um, for uh, the questions that are going to be asked in writing because perhaps they are unable or they're deaf or hard of hearing, or perhaps somebody asked for ASL. Typically, these are not going to require any sort of documentation. Um, some of those most routinely asked are during an online application, people will ask for assistance, ASL or CART. Employers in this situation can only ask if there is no disclosure, whether that candidate can perform the job's essential functions with or without accommodation. And many of us have seen that question asked on an application or been asked that as part of an interview. That really is the only question that can be asked unless the applicant requests that accommodation during that period. And if someone does ask, again, that they are still incredibly limited in the type of question they can ask to ensure that they are providing equal access to the interview, application, or pre-offer phases, and have reasonable information to conclude that somebody does, in fact, have a disability that needs an accommodation. So some of the more common academic and pre-employment accommodations can be an alternative format. Again, additional instructions being provided. During the interview phase, we have ASL and CART. Sometimes people will request questions ahead of time. That's very common. Breaks, especially for those very long and arduous interview processes that might take a day. Written responses rather than oral responses, or additional time to respond to questions. In the testing phase, again, ASL and CART, there might be breaks necessary. Accessible spaces for parking so someone can get to a testing center, additional time to take a test or an alternative format, written instructions again, or having the test be provided to them orally. After an offer of acceptance or hire is made, the employer may request information related to the ability to perform their position. So many employees are compelled to disclose their disability because of medical questions or examinations required before starting employment. And this can be very common in positions with physical requirements such as patient care, or lifting, custodial work, trades, or construction. But also keep in mind this occurs perhaps when an employer does drug testing and an employee or a individual who has received an offer takes medication that might show up for their disability. They may need to disclose to ensure that the employer has the information to understand that this medication showing up is prescribed. It is part of their daily routine and that they have not failed that drug test if that shows up. Keep in mind, an employer cannot rescind a job offer unless the employee cannot perform the job task with or without accommodation, or again, poses a direct threat. So perhaps an individual who was unable to obtain a particular driver's license and they could not get that license with or without accommodation, the employer is not under an obligation to continue on with that offer and employment. They can at that point rescind that job offer, but that is a very limited situation. So similar to the post-offer phase, during employment and during the enrollment of a student, which we'll call that the enrolled student phase, employees and students may, of course, disclose at any time, generally to receive accommodations. An employer and school in this situation may request enough medical documentation to determine the existence of disability and the nexus between the requested accommodation and limitations. Keeping in mind, it may not be appropriate when that disability is apparent. For example, somebody that is requesting accessible parking when they are utilizing a wheelchair. So turning to some of those common accommodations for the employment phase and the enrolled student education phase, after the individual's working or enrolled and taking classes, of course, we see many times requests for private office space or noise canceling headphones, noise machines, CART or ASL, ergonomic items, a flexible schedule, breaks between meetings, additional remote work days beyond what is provided to an entire unit or is perhaps policy within a unit. In the academic setting, requesting things like distraction reduced testing environments, harder ASL, additional absences above and beyond the absence policy of that particular instructor, additional time to complete homework when they are experiencing an exacerbation of symptoms, PowerPoints and notes ahead of time before class, and then perhaps alternate format for assignments and tests. So keeping in mind our timing considerations, we recommend disclosing disability before job or academic performance is affected. There is no requirement for, again, an employer to rescind poor performance evaluations or discipline because an employee or student has requested accommodations afterwards. And there is no requirement to retroactively apply an academic modification or adjust past grades and performance. So what information and to whom? So it really depends. So we're talking about here who we should disclose to. For purposes of requesting accommodations once employed, best practices for disability disclosure include disclosing to either a supervisor. For students, it might be an instructor. If they are experiencing a hardship or limitation, or they need support or assistance to perform a job function or to access their education. They may request resources related to a disability or medical condition from their supervisor or instructor. The other option is a disability office like SSD or our office, Disability Equity Office, or Human Resources. So in the cases of disability office or HR, you would be providing the information about your hardship and limitation, what you need for support and assistance, requesting resources, but you may also be disclosing the documentation of your diagnosis, limitations, as well as some recommendations for an academic modification or workplace accommodation, as well as the estimated length of time that the disability is expected to last. So keeping in mind there are temporary disabilities and then ongoing or chronic disabilities that may not change over time. So for purposes of what you provide to whom, it really does depend on who you are disclosing to. So looking at who employees most often disclose to, many, so 39% do disclose to managers, about 24% to colleagues who, of course, don't have an obligation to provide an accommodation. And then human resources is about at 21%. So with that in mind, we want to briefly discuss what you should not do. It is best practice not to provide a diagnosis or turn in medical documentation directly to your immediate supervisor. Don't provide undated, unsigned medical documentation to HR or to a disability office. But at the same time, also, please don't provide full medical records. Um, that is important. So, based on your function, determines what the process might be if somebody chooses to disclose to you. So if that student, applicant, or employee makes a decision to disclose their disability, it's imperative that supervisors, HR professionals, and instructors, as well as academic advisors and others, know what to do, as well as what constitutes that disclosure. So disclosure can consist of a wide range of information, and it can come in many forms. It can request it can be that there's a request from an employee or student, but you don't have to follow any specific format. It's really important to educate yourself if you're a supervisor or HR professional or an instructor about what the processes are here at the university if you're in a supervisory capacity as well. And you're always welcome to reach out to our office for information about what those processes and procedures look like. So disclosure can really be specific, direct, basic, but also sometimes vague. And a request can also be for an accommodation or perhaps a leave. If someone's requesting a medical leave, which may be handled under FMLA or other leave options, that could still be a disclosure of disability. There's no specific words or format. We can't require it in writing, though we can require people after disclosure to fill information out to provide us for records. And it really does create that affirmative responsibility to engage in the interactive process. So these are some possible disclosures of employees. Somebody who reports having a difficult time getting to work because of their condition, needing alternative lighting in a workspace because they might be getting headaches. New medication is making them too tired to drive in the morning, or they're finding it difficult to stay awake at work. Somebody saying that they really need breaks between meetings. They can't handle back-to-back meetings because they need to decompress. Somebody who reports that their condition flared up, causing them to be late again to work, and that they might be having a difficult time getting to work on time in general because of their condition. Possible disclosures of students can include they're having a hard time concentrating because of noise in a lecture hall. They may request live captioning to participate in class or group assignments. They might say that their mental health condition or maybe their anxiety has been impacting their ability to complete their assignments, or that they have recurring appointments on Wednesdays, so they might be late to class on a regular basis. These are all examples of disclosures to an instructor or to faculty that would count as a disclosure of a disability. So it's important to know what to do in this situation as both a supervisor and an instructor. Thank the employee or student for sharing the information. And it's important, if this is done orally, to respond or follow up in writing as soon as possible, providing those resources and contact information to Disability Equity Office, SSD, Michigan Medicine, HR Solutions Center, etc. If you are handed documentation as a supervisor instructor, hand that in documentation right back and direct them to take that documentation either to their HR or let them know to contact the Disability Equity Office. It's important also as a supervisor and instructor to maintain that confidentiality, to document the steps that you've taken, and of course to follow up after disclosure to ensure that somebody has the resources they need and check in to see if they have any questions, if they've decided to engage in the interactive process. And keep in mind, we need to apply our policies fairly and not just for the employees or students that we like or that are excellent workers. This requirement to engage in the interactive process does cross over to all of our employees and students. We want to ensure that everybody has that equal access, and we need to really take the same steps and document them the same way, regardless of personal feelings. So some tips to remember. What can we ask or what should we ask as supervisors or instructors? How can I help you is the magic question that our office typically will instruct individuals to use in these situations. Also, once somebody makes a disclosure, it's okay for you to respond back and say, I think what I heard you say is, and try to paraphrase that information. What you can do as well in an educational setting is ask the question of the student, what can I do to assist you in being successful in my class or perhaps in employment in a position? Again, provide resources and don't make an assumption about what resources somebody needs. Please keep in mind if they're talking about a mental health condition, provide multiple resources. We do have multiple offices that may provide support in different ways. And depending on what the student or employee needs, it's important to give them both information, perhaps for counseling somewhere on campus, but also for academic or employment accommodations. And don't ask intrusive questions during disclosure or at any time, or question why they need a particular item they've requested or their lived experience. Again, disclosure does create that affirmative duty to engage, and we need to ensure that we are meeting that obligation to engage in the interactive process. The easiest way to ensure that we have met that obligation at a basic level is that referral. So keep in mind referring somebody to our office or SSD or Michigan Medicine HR Solution Center. Document what you have done, follow up in writing, and then allow them to navigate and talk about the process. You also are, of course, able to refer them to their unit HR. So very briefly, we're going to touch on creating disclosure supportive environments with some basic awareness. So if you are engaged as a supervisor in an employment accommodation process, it is absolutely okay to check in after the accommodations are finalized to ensure that they've been implemented, that an employee's received the monitor or the software that they need. And please include, if you're an instructor, faculty, disability resources in your syllabi, as well as in employment, provide it in your onboarding materials. You also want to be sure that you can effectively inform people about resources and processes. And you can, of course, provide reminders that an individual, an employee is able to disclose or ask for accommodations at any time. So what we mean by this is not just day one of employment. Is there anything that would help you to be successful? Check in about 6 months later or set your calendar for an annual reminder that you send out to all employees just to ask if there are things that they might need, either in an ergonomic assessment type of a way or in a specific academic or excuse me, employment perspective. So just because somebody didn't need something day one does not mean that their disability or a condition has not changed over time. So you can also promote accessibility and awareness by encouraging and promoting available webinars and sign up for newsletters like ours that provides information and encourage your staff to do so. Provide ergonomic equipment options just as a means of creating a more inclusive environment. Include accessibility and disability training as part of leadership and staff educational opportunities. Make sure you are holding meetings and events in accessible locations. You're providing accessible documents and resources. Provide multiple modalities to communicate. So if you have a weekly meeting, be sure to have a running agenda where information that's shared with a group is documented so people have a place to go back and refer. You can again provide those annual check-ins by email or recurring meetings to encourage people to request accommodations or accessible items, and ensure again that the documents, not only that you create, are accessible, but those that you might send out to your staff are accessible themselves before you share those.
Allison, this is Erin. We've
Yes.
received a question related to those two slides you just went over.
Yes.
Wouldn't it be simpler if we routinely offered basic accommodations to all people, with people being able to opt out if they don't need the accommodations, similar to the way this webinar was structured?
So what we would call those is, so the short answer is yes. However, again, the law does provide guidance on what we are obligated to do. And again, we really see that as being the floor and not the ceiling. So what I mean by that is if you have items readily available that you want to make available to all of your staff, I think that is wonderful. I think that if you can provide PowerPoints to students ahead of time, regardless of disability, you are absolutely in a position to do that. There's best practices that show that providing individuals with questions before interviews across the board is typically winds up with a more robust and complete interview process. So there are so many different ways that you can provide this to everybody. And if somebody doesn't need something, that is perfectly fine. But having perhaps a closet full of things, items, fidgets, things that people can take, different kinds of lamps, etc., to be successful in the workplace, even, various kinds of mice, it is a great way to approach creating that accessible environment. So for the wrap up here are key takeaways. So for disabled employees or students, please remember self-ID is important. Provide the appropriate level of documentation and be sure you're only providing that documentation to individuals who should have that documentation. Know about available resources, disclose and request accommodations before you have a performance or academic concern. And please do contact us with any questions. If you want to talk through certain scenarios or have questions about anything that you heard today, it's a lot of information. Please feel free to reach out. We will consult with any employees or students. For supervisors, HR, and instructors, remember the magic words of how can I help you? Supervisors and instructors, please do not accept medical documentation. Thank them, but we want to try to ensure that we are keeping performance, both academically and employment-wise, separate from any requests for accommodation to ensure that there can't be any type of concern of perhaps retaliation later. If you don't know what a disability is, nor do you know perhaps anything about the condition, it reduces the risk of concern of discrimination and retaliation for you as a supervisor as well as an instructor. Always thank an individual for that disclosure and their willingness to provide information, provide those resources and a warm handoff. And of course, again, please contact DEO and ask questions. And with that, I will ask Erin if there are any questions remaining that we need to cover at this time.
This is Erin speaking. We do not currently have any other open questions.
Wonderful. So we'll give people a couple minutes to ask about that. And before we end today's webinar, I just want to go through a couple of our slides here. So again, we do have a significant amount of training and upcoming events. Please feel free to check those out. We have an exciting opportunity coming up for a virtual spoon theory. So this will explore spoon theory itself and how to manage your varying levels of spoons that everybody has on any given day. You'll learn a lot about how to support individuals in the workplace as well. Our contact information and our contact form. We do provide trainings and workshops. You can request those through the training and report barrier link. We have a wide and growing number of topics that we can present to your units and to groups. And the report to barrier to access. Please, if you see inoperable door openers or elevators that are out of service, cracked pavement that causes tripping hazards, inaccessible software that you experience, or documents that you routinely receive that are inaccessible. These are all barriers that we need the community's help to identify so that we can address those as they come in and create a much more accessible university and environment for everybody. And again, sign up for our newsletter. We have filterable lists of resources and a YouTube channel as well. And finally, thank you to all of you for joining us, as well as to our CART ASL provider and moderator. And if there's no other questions, we will go ahead and thank everybody, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Allison, this is Erin. We did just have another question come in.
Okay.
What happens if the request or accommodation is needed immediately? For example, if an employee notifies you during the workday that they are drowsy from a new medication and they request time for a short nap, is that a reasonable accommodation?
So that is a very good hypothetical. In that situation, the easiest thing to do would be, of course, to evaluate whether this is a safety issue, um, and allow the individual to utilize their available PTO or sick time. Accommodations need to go through the process and they're called reasonable, because not only does it need to be reasonable for the employer to provide, but that also means reasonable amount of time to request the accommodation, so that it can be evaluated. Remember, we have our four Ds. So we have the disclosure they've made, but we haven't necessarily made a determination that there is a disability at that point. So if they have something that they can utilize, make sure they're safe getting home. We don't want anybody driving while that drowsy that they, are unsafe, but we may want to encourage them to take their PTO or sick time and then follow up by providing all of those resources to them when they are more alert and awake, and move through the process in that way. That's a very good question.
And this is Erin
So
again. There are currently no other questions open for us.
this is Allison speaking. With that, I will say thank you again, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day.